everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host for today, Lana Clabe, and today I'm joined with Chase Hanson as my co-host. And today we have two familiar faces. They joined us last season for MFA Part 1, and so we're back for Part 2. So here we have Fred Brashear. So a little bit about him for those of you who missed the first episode. He went to CSUSB for his undergraduate and for his MFA, and he's currently a professor at 3 universities. And he has some opportunities with Photo LA, as well as being published in a book called California Love. And we also have Andrea Clary. She's an artist currently working on her MFA at Cal State San Bernardino. And then before doing this, she got her Bachelor of Art and Master of Art in Northridge. And her art is sculpture and ceramics that focus on self-acceptance and body positivity. And she's also an associate professor in Cal State San Bernardino. So thank you guys both for joining me. I'm super excited to come back for these Part 2 for the MFA. So I guess we're going to get started. I think, today we're going to talk about some of the negative stereotypes that surrounds, pursuing a degree in arts and, a career in art. So I think before we get started, maybe a little background on both you guys. So why don't we go ahead and start with you, Fred, since you've been kind of doing this a little longer than all of us here. What led you to first decide to pursue a degree in art?
That's a really good question. Okay, so I kind of came in through like the back door, if you will, to the art world. Always as a kid, I was very creative, drawing, building things, doing things like that. But, somewhere along the line, I kind of lost focus of that and, really kind of focused more towards like STEM careers. And became a firefighter and started documenting my travels on a helicopter crew around the Western United States. And so with the camera. And so once that career ended, photography was still very much in my focal plane. And so I kept with it and just, one thing led to another and got my education in photography and fine arts. And that's kind of how it all started. So.
Awesome. And then if I remember correctly, Andrea, from the last time we talked, you kind of had like a sort of similar experience where it's like around back to art. So how was that for you?
Yeah, it kind of came back into my life when I was younger. I always dreamt of being in fashion, working in fashion design. But then I went to school for marine biology. And while I was at CSUN for marine biology, I had to take an art class. So I took ceramics and just immediately found myself being a studio rat in there. Like I never left. I was always making. And I incorporated some background in marine biology and fashion in my pieces when I was an undergrad. And then that's what led me today with the whole body positivity movement in fashion as well. So I came to it super late, but I'm so glad I found it.
Wow. And then I'm curious, what about you, Chase? Because I know that you're involved with arts. Has it always been like that, or was there?
No, my story is something like Andrea's actually. I always wanted to do something in STEM, always wanted to do something preferably on the science side of that acronym. Until in high school, I took a ceramics class just to fill out my art requirement. And just like Andrea, 2 years later, I hadn't left the studio once. I'm like, And so I do kind of come at it from that STEM-ish background. Ceramics is a discipline that involves a lot of chemistry, a lot of physics, and not just ceramics, glass blowing and other 3D mediums too. So I'm kind of always approaching it from that angle of how can I push things interestingly, technologically.
Right.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like when we make glazes and ceramics, it's all these different elements of mixing them together and the final outcome. And if you have some sort of knowledge with these chemicals, you're going to know what will work and what won't work. And there's a lot of that in ceramics, and I'm sure glass as well. I'm just taking glass for the first time, so I'm learning about that too. But it's really interesting how, some of your background will pull up, and maybe that's the reason why I was drawn to it, because there was this element compound that was very interesting, that I was doing the same in my chemistry labs and ceramics. So it was a nice intertwine of worlds.
And then even photography, doesn't it involve some level of, you know, chemistry when it comes to developing photos and like just knowing how the camera works itself?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially with analog and, you know, the traditional darkroom techniques. I mean, it's all chemical based and so, you know, yeah. So, I mean, there's, you know, there's science in everything, right? And so
Right.
it's interesting.
Right. And it's funny because, talking to three of you guys, you know, all had this moment of, you know, going to STEM, you know, looking at the STEM. And then I had that same experience too. I spent the first 3 years of my undergrad, you know, in kinesiology, which, you know, is completely different from the arts. So it's interesting that we have, you know, 4 people here who are pursuing or have pursued and, you know, got their degree in art. Yet at some point we all had this moment of, you know, pursuing STEM. And do you guys think that that's a coincidence, or do you think that there's a reason for that?
That's a good question. I think, you know, decisions are always based upon experience, right? And so, you know, I can't speak for the 3 other people, but as far as myself, you know, I just didn't enjoy what I was doing after a while, right? You know, there's a rigidness to STEM classes where the information is just the information, right? There's really nothing outside of that. There's no gray area. It's either black or it's white. And so I think that, you know, I was looking for something more, right? And so I had questions about things, and I wanted to express myself in a different way other than, you know, just through this rigidness. And I think that's what, you know, changed my career path as far as pursuing the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that. I am a firm believer that I want to wake up every day and do something that I love in my work career. And when I was getting, you know, my science degree, I was not happy at all, and that's why I found myself like at the studio all the time, making work, and like Fred said, expressing myself through that medium versus, you know, science. And it was a more relatable field as well too. And, you know, and then once I changed my major, I just became a happier person.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, you know, I remember when I decided to, because there was always something in the back of my mind where I was like, okay, what about art? What about art? But I still stuck with kinesiology for 3 years. But I think, you know, the point, like that turning point for me was when it was like the first day of school. I had signed up for 2 kinesiology classes, and I was absolutely dreading having to go to those. And I'm like, something's amiss here if I'm like dreading going to my major classes. But it is interesting that, you know, we all kind of started, you know, looking at STEM, and like, yeah, we still use it. We still have that background. But at the end of the day, we found out that wasn't for us. You know, we all had that.
Yeah, do you think the reason why you stayed so long is because you were afraid of like telling other people like, oh, I switched my major to an art major, and that the, you know, negativity that comes with that? You know, I was terrified too. Like, I remember being in college, like everyone knew what I was going for college for. And then finally, like my junior year, I changed. And when I went from like, oh yeah, I'm marine biology to, oh, I'm studio visual arts, like, you know, and they're like, oh, you know, it's just like that weird, like, excuse me, like, kind of like you're ashamed of it when you shouldn't be, just because of like what society puts down on art people and art majors.
Yeah. And then, you know, at least for me culturally, like I come from a cultural background where STEM is really encouraged. So I do think like part of it was me being stubborn, be like, if I just hold on for my degree, it's all going to get better. I think that there was that stubbornness in me that kept me for 3 years. But then also it's part of like, I have to go, you know, face my family, my friends, you know, like my relatives, you know, people in my, you know, community, like in my cultural community, and say like, oh, I'm switching from this, you know, really, you know, not prestigious, but, you know, like a really good field to study in, to switch to art. And I wouldn't say it's looked down upon, but you do get that, oh, look, when you say like, oh, I'm studying art.
Yeah, totally. I've gotten many of that.
I think I received a fairly warm kind of welcome to that from my family and my parents. But they were they weren't coming from it to it from a place of really understanding it very well. On the other hand, I have a lot of educators in my family. My mom is an English professor at a half dozen community colleges around the state. My dad trains union plumbers and pipe fitters at apprentice and journeyman level in his trade school. And so for them, they just kind of saw it as another field for me to teach in. They're not looking at it much past that. They see, you can teach it, yeah. So while it was a warm welcome, you know, I don't think they were necessarily understanding it thoroughly.
Right. And then what about you, Fred? What was, you know, people's reaction in your immediate circle when you went for art?
To be totally honest, I think they were just happy that I made a decision, right? And so in anything at some point, right? Because, you know, when I first started my educational journey, it was biology. And then it changed from biology to computer science, and then from computer science back to biology, and then from biology to fire science. And so it was just this, and then back to computer science, back to biology. And so there was always this flip flop. So I think my family was just like, oh my, thank you for finally choosing something and sticking with it, right? No, but seriously, I mean, that was the kind of reception that I got when, you know, I told people, yeah, you know, I'm, you know, MFA in studio arts and things like that. And they're like, oh, really? Like, what does that entail? And so I talked about them, and they're like, oh, okay, that's interesting, right? So they're like, oh, so you play all day? And I'm like, exactly, right? You play all day, right? So.
Right, that's great. So I think, you know, going back to, you know, what Shay said about the unknown, like people not fully understanding, I also came across that in my experience because I wanted to do art conservation. And so I've always had to explain to people what that is, because it's not something you hear on a daily basis, like, oh, art conservation. It's not, you know, really popular in, you know, modern society today. So I find myself, you know, saying like, oh, this is what it is. And, you know, it does involve a lot of STEM. I have to study, you know, biology, organic chemistry, a lot of chemistry and things like that. But I find myself almost reassuring people like, oh, don't worry, there's science in it. So what do you guys think of that? Like, why do you think we as a society look so highly upon the sciences and kind of put it aside?
Oh, I think it all comes down to salary wise. I think the more money you make and have seem to be more successful in life. And you know, doctors, surgeons, scientists, they, you know, it's like the cream of the crop. That's what your goal should be. And you know, and it's interesting because for me, it's how happy you are, you know, waking up and doing what you want to do. And if it is becoming a surgeon, like, you know, like that's awesome. Unfortunately for me, you know, but you know, like I think it comes down to that there's like, you know, stereotypes of artists of being like this starving artist lifestyle, and America doesn't like that.
Right. Yeah, I remember when I guess broke the news to my parents, like, oh, I want to study art. You know, one of the things that I really had to do to, you know, not encourage them, but to reassure them that I'm making the right choices, I had to sit down and be like, this is like potential salary of an art conservator, you know, like this is the steps and stuff like that. And that was the one thing that made people like, okay, I guess you could do this. I guess this is
right.
It was showing the numbers.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, with me, it was all like, oh, I want to be an artist. They're like, what's that? And it's like, well, I could teach at university. Oh, okay, yeah, totally. You know, kind of like Chase, you know, like you're seen to be as an educator, you know, and I'm just like, I want to be a working artist. Like, you know, like, why isn't that not good enough?
I think a large part of it comes from a place of just not knowing a lot, not understanding a lot, because people do have a lot of experience in encounters with those doctors and with engineers and with business people in their daily lives. But if they think of artists at all, they're thinking of that kind of starving artist trope, and they're not thinking of the entire world behind it. They're not thinking of the conservators in museums keeping things together. They're not thinking of the educators kind of helping art to leak into other disciplines. They're not thinking of all the economic consequences of the art industry as a whole and all these different careers. Just because they kind of don't know about it and they haven't been
Right.
exposed to it.
Yeah, definitely. So,
And I think also there's a stereotype, there's a certain stereotype, and that, unfortunately comes from the 60s and 70s, right? Like all artists are hippies, all artists are, and like there's, like, well, if you're an artist, you really don't have a end game as far as career, and which is obviously not true, right? And so I think that kind of plays a role in, that idea of the arts is really not, turn it into anything. Right? And so,
right.
Yeah.
really interesting.
And a lot of people only have that idea of the starving artist, and they don't understand that there are levels even within just working artists alone. There are your starving artists and your college students, but there are also many, many artists who are working artists who sell pieces month after month, working on them constantly and make good money that way, all the way up to these mega figures and celebrity artists like Jeff Koons or whomever, who are making the real big bucks and are really making it at the top end of their career.
Right. And then I know Freddie mentioned, going back to the 60s and 70s, that's kind of like where the stereotypical artist comes from. And so I do think, the not impression, but the stereotype that we have of an artist changes over time. Like when you look in history, like from the Renaissance or Baroque, things like that, the people, like the famous people that you think of from those time periods are all artists. Like those are like the well-known figures from the past. And then it seems like we kind of moved away from it as we, continued into, the present day. Do you guys see, as we move forward in time, that society would become more understanding and accepting of the arts, or do you think we're just moving further and further away from it?
I think that there's already a more of an understanding for the arts. If we look at, just business and entrepreneurship and things like that and business models, they're going out and actually, actively seeking creatives to, think outside the box and to bring them into the folds of the business, right? And so I think that, there is kind of this warming period right now towards people that are creatives and that are artists, because they can think outside of the box and outside of that rigidity again that we were talking about before. And we as artists, we have, quote unquote soft skills, right? And so these soft skills are needed in these business environments to people skills, right? And so I think that there is a warming up of artists, and I think that hopefully it will continue.
And I think this is reflected economically too. You see major sectors and industries that were traditionally relegated to as just being art, just being creatives, that are getting bigger and bigger and huger every year. Everything from video games to like online commissions of paintings are just getting bigger and bigger and more accepted that way.
And also museums too. I feel like, there's that Van Gogh exhibition that is coming here, is already here, and a lot of people are drawn to the social media aspect of like, oh, is this, I'm looking at art, and it's like this whole like Instagram photo shoot, but which is, they're out there like looking at art and everything. I went to the Broad 2 years ago, I guess. Last year we couldn't see any art. And it was insane of like just seeing, all these people fill up this museum, and a lot of it was people posing with the art, for like an Instagram, like, and that to me is like crazy. They're posting next to Jeff Koons, and it's just like a photo shoot. And I feel like that's kind of weird, but also, maybe that little thing will, be some knowledge to someone who has no knowledge about art or anything. And it's like this whole like fab that's going on. But, art, like what Fred was saying, like art's everywhere. You have, people hiring people just become like an artist for this company.
Hmm. So what I'm hearing, we talked about, the digital space now, that brings to mind like graphic designers and things like that, and like museums with, people coming to Instagram. So it seems like the common thing between, like why art seems to be doing better now is technology in a way. And that almost seems ironic because I feel like people would think like technology and art, that doesn't really mix. Like technology is science, art is, not science for the most part. But it almost seems like technology is saving art. Would you guys agree with that?
I think right now, yeah, for sure. With being in the pandemic, I feel like there's been killer digital art out there, and it's amazing. And it's like this whole new wave that's coming into the art world, as 3D printing, like Photoshop, Procreate, Illustrate, everyone using digital platforms to get their art out there. And it's super interesting to be like living through it and seeing it develop even more.
Right. And that brings to mind, Andrea, we were talking about this yesterday during our run through about how you're having your show coming up and how you're working on documenting everything digitally. I feel like
Mhm.
that also saved a lot of, artists and museums is, when the pandemic happens, we're not able to see art in person. So we went to, I don't want to say virtual, well, yeah, virtual reality and, doing 3D modeling and things like that. And Chase, that's what you've been mostly working on now since the pandemic. So I think,
Yeah, the kind of lockdown has allowed us to make really huge leaps really fast in not just the work itself, but in the kind of priorities we have around digital exhibitions, around the accessibility of our work, around the ways that we can distribute it to people without requiring them to walk in a door of a place that may be very out of the way for them. And so
Mhm.
that's kind of it. It's that kind of democratization of art and of showing off art that the technology enables that's really allowing things to have a new life in 2021.
right, definitely.
Makes the world smaller, right? Makes it way smaller, honestly. And so that's, yeah, absolutely. I
Right.
think, art and technology, they have to go hand in hand, because they're both fields are always evolving, right? And so
Mhm.
different concepts, different ideas. And so I think that, yeah, they definitely go hand in hand.
Yeah, totally. I feel like this whole pandemic was a way of us creators to be even more creative, to get art out there, to be like seen and heard. When the museums were closed, the galleries were closed, no shows were happening. I was supposed to be in a show and it got canceled because of the pandemic. And then luckily, I was in another show back in January, and it was all digitally, and it was through Tumblr, like that format. And I thought this is kind of cool and interesting, and it's on like Tumblr. I felt like I haven't been on Tumblr since high school, and now like using that platform again to way of to view art from a show is so interesting. And I feel like we're digging up old stuff that we have to be creative to like get our art out there and shown, because I think it's crazy. I feel so weird not seeing art like every weekend or something, because everything's closed and the lockdowns. So I found myself even with museums like making everything virtually is also really amazing, and the turnaround for that was super fast. Like I feel like we're just like creative thinkers, and we just like problem solve very nicely.
Right. And to bounce off of that, the way I've always thought about it is, being challenged and having limitations leads to the most creativity in a way. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes,
Yes.
totally. Yes, I like that a lot. um for my thesis show, I right when the pandemic hit, I moved everything to my home studio. And I'm like, I had to make a home studio in my like living room. I'm like working right next to the fireplace with ceramics. And um my work got really really small. And so it's interesting to see how my work changed as well, with the limitations I had to deal with of not having a studio and a big space to work with. And, that was the whole start of my thesis show. And then finally, when I got granted through the university that I can work on in my studio through these X amount of days, then I was like, I'm going to go big or go home, So it's like this huge, like, okay, we're going through this, the world is going through something, but how can I still be true to myself during this time in my art? And if it's just, shrinking the pieces of like how I make it, I'm gonna make it, like I'm gonna do this.
Right.
So
And I think, that's one of the things that are overlooked with artists. Like when people hear like, oh, you're an artist, they think like, oh, you just, kind of sit in the studio and just do whatever you want and mess around. But I feel like there's a lot of traits that artists have like overlooked. And I think one of those is our determination, because, it takes a lot to make art. It's, it could be physically draining, it could be mentally draining, emotionally draining. But I think one thing that we do have is that determination.
totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And bringing back to adapting and changes, like I had that moment too, Andrea. Mine was a little different because like I'm mostly a painter for the most part. Due to like medical conditions I have and things like that, I was no longer able to hold paintbrushes for a long amount of time and things like that. And it was during that time that I feel like I made my best art, because I took up finger painting instead, which is completely different than traditional like painting with a paintbrush. But I feel like in those challenges and in those limitations, that's when you're able to kind of free yourself in a way. And it seems almost contradictory, because you think like, oh, with limitations, you're not going to be able to make the best thing. And like, sure, I'm not able to make exactly what I want, but within those limitations, that's when we most, I guess, thrive.
Right. I feel exactly the same way. We go through these hardships and you're like, this is not what I'm used to. But how can I still be true to myself and work it, even though I have to change things? And I feel like artists are really good to adapt with that, because you're like, okay, I still need a paint. You're like, I can't hold a paintbrush, but I still need a paint. So I'm going to paint with my fingers, like
Right.
it's great. Like me, I'm like, I can't build big, but I'm going to build really small. So it's like, I just still need to get my hands on that material. It's like, no matter what I do, I still gotta get it out of me. And I feel like it's super interesting. And I'm sure like everyone has a story like that.
Right. Definitely. So, going forward with this, there is definitely that negative stereotype around artists. And for the most part, it is false, because we have so many other qualities other than, oh, we just make things. There's our adaptability, our flexibility, our determination and things like that. So what can we do? I guess we'll do this in two parts. First, we'll say, as an individual, what can we do to kind of challenge those negative stereotypes and show people that you're not going to be the starving artist if you pursue your art?
That's a really good question. I mean, I guess it's changing, the perception of what artists are and what they do now, right? And so I think that's where, perception is where we need to make the biggest changes, right? Especially for, those that are outside of the art field and they're looking in, right? Because we all know that, it's when we're inside and we're looking out, it's a lot different. And so I think perception is where we have to start. And how we start doing that, maybe it's, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's through education, right? And I mean, outreach, public outreach, and making people understand that, art was the first way you learned, right? In kindergarten, like, you had your colors, you had your shapes, and you started to play and you started to build, and that's how you first learned. And so, just because we continue to play and we still, are using those creative abilities, doesn't, necessarily make us any different, right? So, I mean, that's, so perception.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I feel like also, when you talk to people about, this is what I'm studying, this is my degree, this is, my career. I also think, just showing by example, I guess, too, is kind of what you're getting at. It's, showing like, hey, I have my degree in art, I'm working in the arts, and look, I'm not a starving artist,
Yeah.
So do you guys think that there's anything that we can do? Because that's what we can do individually, right? As like person to person in our daily, conversations with people around us, is, to kind of open their eyes and make them understand that there's so much more to art than, the starving artist. But is there anything that we could do maybe as a whole society to kind of change those negative perceptions of art?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah, I'm like, I have no clue.
I mean, you know, we have to change the system, right? We have to change the system in which we're all just basically a cog in, right? And so, you know, and it's funny because, you know, we get our degrees, but if you really think about it, you don't really need a degree to be an artist, right? And so our degrees are for other things in the field for us to be able to do, not necessarily to be an artist. So I think that's what needs to kind of change, right? Is just the way the system is structured and the way the system is built, and that, you know, I think that, you know, there has to be this mutual agreement that, you know, without creativity, without design, without things of in the artistic nature, that, you know, the world would just be kind of like blah, right? And so
Yeah.
you know, that old analogy, what's the earth without art? It's like right? And so it's like, you know, like there has to be some kind of mutual agreement, and there's, you know, this system of the idea that you need to have, you know, these certain degrees to be successful, right? And I think that's where, you know, education comes in, and that's where we need to start changing people's perception as far as you know, what art is and what artists do, and what an art degree can offer, right?
Right. And I feel like you said, it starts at the beginning, kind of like with education. So like I remember like from my high school days, I remember it was like first day freshman year, and they were just asking us like what our plans are for high school, what do we want to achieve. I remember one of the questions like, who here wants to join a sports team? And then like everyone in the class raised their hand. And I don't remember, you know, there being a question about who wants to take an art class. So I also feel like, you know, it's our culture and education. I know that Chase, you mentioned that, you know, that's how you kind of came into the arts. It's through, I think you said in high school. So did your high school, Chase, in particular, like emphasize the arts, or was it just like you found your way to it?
No, as far as that kind of arts goes, not at all. They really wanted to push people towards music, or more likely, it was the same requirement for either a sport or art. You could take either one. And they definitely pushed people towards the star football team or the star water polo team.
Right.
Yeah, I think education is the big thing there. If we're only teaching people about the very introductory level of starting artists, or on the other end, we're only teaching them about the mega great artists of old, the Mozarts and the Monets and all those, then people only get that idea. So I think educating people about more like what working artists do in day-to-day lives, more how artists can work in other industries and sectors and other parts of the art world. Maybe our curatorship of art shouldn't be just focused on that art of old. Maybe the curatorship could be teaching people about curatorship itself. We could be teaching them about conservation. We could be teaching them about all these other factors that are consequences of art that just kind of miss our education entirely and don't happen until you're already very deeply invested into art.
Right. And one thing that also comes to mind is, you know, when I talk to people like, oh, I'm an artist, people are like, oh, I can never, I don't know how to draw. I feel like a lot of people don't realize like you don't have to draw to be an artist. There's so many other things in it. And not only that, but like I feel like it's really beneficial to take an art class because yeah, sure, maybe you don't know how to draw. You don't need to though. I feel like art classes also kind of train your brain to think differently too.
Yes, I can stand for that. I cannot draw. I cannot paint. I'm horrible at it. Like, don't ever ask me to sketch something because it's gonna come out with stick figures. You know, like it's not my deal. But it's interesting because then I look at it through like through 3D perspective versus a 2D perspective, and you know, but it's always like, oh, I'm an artist. Oh, you're a painter. It's like the first thing that goes. I'm like, excuse me, no, but you know, there's so many like different mediums in art, and it's sad that the first thought is you're a painter, you know, but that goes back to education, like what we learn in high school and middle school about art were the painters, you know, and that's how it was back then. And unfortunately, in high school, there's very limited art classes. And then when you get to college, you have to take an art class, and usually people take art history. And that's what you all learn, is about the great painters in the different art movements. So it's just like, it's great that they're learning about art, but it's also sad that it's always like just subject to that one medium.
Right.
Yeah.
And then even going back to, sculpture, like whether you're working, subtractively or shoot, what's the other one? Subtractive and additive.
Additive, yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, shoot, what's the other?
I got you.
I feel like that is such a great skill to learn, because it really trains your brain to think in that three-dimensional space that not a lot of people have experience with, that you're not going to get in other ways. And it's super beneficial. And I'm pretty sure that's something that involves, like, what's that one test for the military? I feel like there's something like that too, where like one of the skills that they test you on is, your 3D mental capacity, or I don't know what the term is, but
Yeah.
that's definitely like a good skill to learn.
Right.
One of the best ways to get it is, working hands-on and creating something 3D, and knowing that you have to think of the object in all dimensions, not just the 2D.
Right.
So super beneficial to learn. Okay.
It is. It's super interesting of, some people are more, they're always like, I'm a hands-on learner, and that's how they learn, versus a textbook learner, and I feel like everyone learns a different way. It's like, oh, I mainly work with my right brain versus my left brain. I don't know. There's that whole science too about it. And it's weird. Maybe all of us artists are working with the left brain. That's why we're all artists, right? We work with our left brain. I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like also, like, art can be such a good, like, teaching tool, even in the STEM fields. Like, I remember in high school, the things that really helped me learn was, drawings. Like when I was in biology, the way that I learned the cells was drawing them and labeling them and coloring them, and little flip book. And I remember when I was in anatomy, there was this extra credit project that we could make a 3D model of like the cross section of the skin, and get all those structures and features in. And I like, that is one of my most vivid memories, of taking anatomy. That's what stuck to me the most, because I had that time to really work hands-on and learn about the different layers, getting that into my brain, because I was making it myself. So it really made it like concrete, and it made it real. Because like when you look at cells, like when you're learning about cells, it's hard to know that it's a real thing, because we always see like these these clip art 2D drawings of them in our textbooks. And I feel like, at least when you first start learning about them, it's hard to realize that these are like actual 3D things that your body's made up of. But I feel like a good way to do that is through art.
Right. And like what Fred said, that we start art right off the bat in kindergarten. So the way that we, red is for apple, yellow's for duck, we associate everything with colors. And I feel like that's what helps us memorize. Well, the thing is like coloring, like how you organize stuff is color based, and that's all deals with art as well. Right.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think that's what we have time for today. Thank you guys so much. I think this was such a great conversation. I feel like we all have, I don't want to say homework, but I feel like we're all kind of empowered now to be like, hey, I'm an artist, and that's a good thing. It's not anything.
You got be like, I'm a kick-ass artist. Like, like that's what I do. And we don't own any explanation. You never ask like a doctor, like, why are you a doctor? You're just like, oh, they're a doctor, which I love doctors. Thank you. But like, but like still like, why? But I'm an artist, and it should just be at the period. That's it. Like hold your statement.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me. I really enjoyed this discussion. So we're going to go ahead and switch to Q&A. So for those of you guys in the audience, if you guys have any questions for Fred and Andrea, or Chase and myself, please go ahead and drop those into the chat, and we will get to them as they come. And then as you guys do that, for the time being, we are going to go to a pre-submitted question. So one question that we have is, do different cultures today see art differently? So if we're looking at, just across the globe, do we all globally see art in this? Does it change before you go?
I was watching I'm Korean, so I was watching a K-drama, and one of the guys was a graphic designer, and the way that other people in the K-drama were talking about, like, oh, he's a graphic designer, like, oh no, like kind of like that starving artist role. And I was just like, I'm like, oh my God, what does my family see me as, really? I'm just like, oh my God. So like that was like and that was like the whole K-drama I was watching was about, he's never going to be good enough because he's a graphic designer. It was very interesting to like see that.
Right.
I think a good place to start is like looking at how we might be different rather than looking at how other places might be different to us. Because in America, we have this very kind of not necessarily commercialized, but very like fine art kind of idea of art. We think of it as something that costs $10 million and sits in some ridiculously expensive New York museum all day, and that's it. And that's kind of our idea of art, and that's it, which is very, very different from the artisanal and craftsmanship focused like craftspeople traditions in many, many places around the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think, Chase brings up a very good point, right? You think around the world, art was more of a function of culture than it was, outside of it, right? And so, if, looking back throughout history, art was used to tell stories. Art was used politically to get a message across. Art was used symbolically to communicate. And so I think that's, very an interesting idea that, here in America, we, when we hear art, it's either, highbrow or lowbrow, right? And so, okay, you're either in a museum or you're down at the boardwalk in Venice selling your crafts, right? And so that's, I mean, there's like no happy medium, right? And so that's an interesting point.
Right. Coming like for my example, like I'm culturally, I'm, from the Middle East. And so I feel like, at least in my generation, especially for, the women that are my age, it's very stressed to, go into the STEM because STEM is like such a great field to go into. And that culturally is, what's really emphasized, pretty much all the girls I know my age, like in my culture are going into STEM. And don't get me wrong, that's great. But I feel like it should also be, like, hey, if you want to go into art, that's still an option. And the funny thing is, looking back and going to, what Fred said, that there's different types of art. My grandpa was an artist, and unfortunately he died before I was able to meet him. But from the art I've seen from him, all of it is either functional or religious. So I've heard stories of him, working in churches, kind of designing the churches, doing art for the churches. And then I think one pieces I've seen from him is, I think he made like a lampshade out of like stained glass or something. So like a lot of functional pieces too. So art can serve multiple different purposes. And I think going back to what Chase said, we're a more commercialized society where all of our objects are kind of made in factories and mass produced and things like that. So we lose that artisanal elements, I think, like that handmade, the craftsman working hours to make this object for you. I think that's something that's kind of lost in our society.
Yeah, totally. I think so. And hopefully we could bring back the, like, like the originality of new pieces versus just, mass consumption.
Right. So we don't have a question in the chat, but we do have a little comment. I would love to read it because this, I just kind of skimmed it briefly and it looks amazing, what our audience said. So the comment is, I could relate to it all. I got a BFA in advertising and design in the 80s and didn't do much with art or graphics till the last few years. If the attitude of others and my own mindset was that I could do art as a career, I would have had a much different life. Don't compromise with what you love. So I love that last sentence. Don't compromise with what you love. I think that's a great place for us to leave off of. That's kind of our takeaway. Don't compromise, be you, be true to yourself and do what you love.
Yes. Confidence, yes.
All right, so thank you again so much, both of you, Fred and Andrea, for joining me today. Thank you, Chase, for coming as my co-host today. So thank you everyone for tuning in. We do have a few announcements. If you liked what you heard today and you want to hear some other stuff in the future, we do have our next episode on April 22nd. So me, Chase, and then our other co-host Erica will be looking at some articles relating to art, histories, and museum. And we're going to look at those articles, discuss them, react to them, and have our thoughts on it. Also this Saturday, April 10th at 1:30, we do have a Redeeming Demons lecture and Q&A. So please be sure to check that out. So thank you everyone again for listening. And then I will see you guys in the future. So thank you everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us back.
Thank
It's
you.
so much fun. It was nice seeing you, Fred.
Nice seeing you too, Andrea.
Yeah.
Good luck with your show.
Thanks. I'll send you all the link.
Yes.
Please.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Have a nice day. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Take care, everyone.